I'm grateful to have a few minutes to speak and address some of these issues that confront us as a nation, confront us in the western part of this country, but particularly in Arizona. Land management and species management are critically important issues everywhere in this country, but especially so in the West. Nationwide, the federal government owns 1 out of every 3 acres. But when you go to the West, it's 1 out of every 2 acres. Well, in fact, in my state, in Arizona, only about 20% of the total land area is in private hands. Federal holdings actually exceed the size of the state of Virginia. Of course, federal control over land means that bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., rather than knowledgeable state and local officials, get to set the rules. And that's certainly the case when it comes to the Endangered Species Act. ESA listings, in theory, are meant to give short-term support for species recovery. They're not supposed to turn into permanent classifications. However, as we've been hearing a litany of stories in this special order tonight, and as everyone who participates in this country know, the reality is far different. In fact, fewer than 2% of species, actually less than 2% of species, have been removed from the ESA list. Another significant problem is that current U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service policies make it far easier to actually list a new species than to examine the current list for potential removal. Excessive ESA listings place enormously costly requirements on private landowners and even state and local government agencies. For this reason, I introduced the List Act in the last Congress to greatly speed up the rate at which recovered species may be taken off the ESA list once the Secretary of the Interior receives objective data that the species in question has recovered. I'm pleased to see that my good friend from Montana, Representative Greg Gianforte, is championing the List Act this year. It's a great piece of legislation. Meanwhile, I'm aiming to reform the ESA from an entirely different perspective with a new bill I introduced last week that I'm calling the American Sovereignty and Species Protection Act. I'd bet that most Americans would be surprised to learn that the ESA currently allows the U.S. government to buy foreign land, that's right, non-U.S. land in foreign nations, to protect endangered species in other countries. While this may be a well-intentioned policy, it's tragically naive. Remember that just because a Department of the Interior official purchases foreign land with the hope that it will be used to protect endangered species does not mean that a foreign government will see things in the same way. Because the U.S. does not have sovereignty over the internal affairs of other nations, we exert especially little influence over the developing nations in which so many endangered species live. I would much rather see taxpayer dollars used to advance domestic priorities. The American Sovereignty and Species Protection Act, the List Act, and all of the other ESA modernization efforts we've been talking about today in this packet of bills will help us to scale back bureaucratic overreach and still ensure that critically endangered species are protected. Both aims are achievable. And as the Western Caucasus Chief Regulatory Officer, I will work with great leaders like those who've spoken, like our host today, Dan Newhouse from Washington, to ensure that our goals are met. And with that, Mr. Newhouse, thank you for your leadership. Thanks for yielding time to me, and I yield back.